Chapter 6. Aftermath. Darius had seen much after the Battle of Blackmaw. His own health was relatively unchanged compared to the masses around him. In truth, he might be infected. He just wasn't showing signs yet. Sometimes it took years, but it would take him, sooner or later. He looked over at his men, some of whom coughed up fluids and convulsed. Half of them would not last the month. He half wished to put them out of their misery, but what if there was a chance they could heal? "Well, we did it," Meredith said, approaching. Luckily, he too had shown no signs of decay, although he admitted to himself that fatigue had been bothering him more and more. Likely he would get delayed symptoms. Darius looked to Meredith, his yellow eyes a dull color now. "I suppose we did. The war is over." Meredith looked over at his men. "I suppose what happens next is, one by one, we send messages to their families and friends about the state of their health. We're dead men, but I suppose the families should be brought in to grieve." Darius couldn't allow it. "No, we can't even allow family members to visit. Healers say there's still the small possibility of the dark dust particles spreading from coughs or from remnants of clothing or some such. Is Scipio better?" Meredith motioned to the corner of the room. "He's worse. He's shaking and uncomfortably warm. He's under blankets and he won't stop shaking. Augustana is fine, but spiritually she's lost, considering what she heard." Darius ended that conversation. "Enough. We shan't speak of it. For now, the city of Xing funds the relative comfort of the survivors and pays for a warrior's death for each of those brought back. We'll have aid enough for years, but after that, who can say?" Meredith thought back a bit. "I mean, we were damned good at what we did, but I suppose peace was bound to come sooner or later. Not sure what I'll do with myself." Darius let a smile show. "Well, if you need a job, I'll be happy to recommend you to whatever you wish. Of course, I might have an opening soon for you in what may be my new employment." Darius handed him a letter. Meredith looked at the letter and opened and read it. "General Gaust, he has a job for you. I doubt he could have much left to pay us with." Darius wasn't sure. "He claims he does. I was hoping Scipio would stabilize, but—" Augustana approached, her beauty lessened by her expression, that of a woman lost in thought. She had seen death before, but not like this, her own comrades. It was disheartening the way they died. No prayer or spell could aid them. "My magic can do little for Scipio." "Maybe you should try a blanket. Here." Darius tossed her a blanket, knowing full well that wasn't a true solution, but it was better than nothing. She was slow to catch it. "Hey, what are you doing after this? I mean, you got somewhere else you're going?" said Meredith, changing the subject as best he could. Augustana shook her head. She didn't know, nor could she. She thought about working at a temple, or helping those in need, but everything seemed a waste. What could she do? She did not want her world to end, nor could she just do nothing. "I do not. I am at a loss." Darius spoke plainly. "If I were to send for you with employment, would you come?" A moment of consideration, and then a nod. She would come. Meredith would come. Hell, even Scipio would come. He'd find a way. They were a team, and at some point they must have become friends. None of them would be able to say when. Augustana wasn't ready for other work. "Perhaps for now, I would like to stay here and help those I can. But yes, I would. What are you going to try to do?" Darius supposed he didn't have a true answer. "I have a goal. Whether or not I can achieve it is another matter. Right now I'd like to change the world. Medicine for these men, then perhaps medicine for the world. Anything I can do to extend the life cycle, I'll do." Augustana looked him over curiously. "What are you planning to do? Do you have a solution?" Darius did not, and it showed. He planned to keep going until some sort of solution came to him, or at least something that would tide him over. "I'll deal with one problem at a time. For now, I'd like to visit General Gaust." Stopping the world from using magic was a daunting task. Even harder to fathom were the demigods and lesser gods that might one day take their magic with them. For now, he had to focus on his summons from the general. It would be a long trip. Chapter 7. Xing. Xing was a city of builders and master tradesmen. Their story goes back as far as their leader and founder, Shen. although the details of Shen's life are greatly exaggerated even to this day. He was impressive in a number of trade skills. The story goes that he founded Xing as a place to master all trades. Beginning as a boy, he lived multiple lifestyles. He had lived amongst farmers and mastered the art of sowing and harvesting seed, and studied many agricultural fields and animal husbandry. He tended to crops and studied them for a short time. In the short time of his boyhood, he solved many problems with plant growth, encouraged crop rotation, and improved methods of storage. It is said he studied ores and mining under the dwarves and learned about magic from the elves. In his day, he found elements that could be learned from ancient traditions. However, his new and innovative methods were what caused Xing to prosper. Wells were dug and water purification became commonplace. He pitched many ideas that could not yet be completed, sewers and aqueducts. He found places to mine ore and used coal to refine it. With his knowledge gained in alchemy, he pressed hard on the importance of steel. Before long, he had many followers and students, many experts, within trades of their own. Shen used the combined knowledge of multiple races and cultures. But Xing would tolerate none who did not work. Those seen as useless were quickly cast away. Xing began to attract half-elves and all sorts of craftsmen. It began to sell goods through its port. Shen learned about the shaping of wood and the construction of buildings. He made a place that would house the innovative and hard-working. The borders of Xing grew over time, and the constructions of home using non-traditional means became commonplace. Buildings that functioned as large taverns and halls were common, letting many sleep cheaply. If you wanted a house, you needed to build it yourself. Such was the insistence of Shen. Over time, the city acquired wealth and grew from a town to a city. He never stopped attempting to find improvements in all forms of craft. Eventually, the local currency was emblazoned with the face of Shen and the 12 houses, one for each house that mastered a trade. Their wealth and influence began small at first, but soon the world saw itself foolish for not trading with the city of Xing. The boundaries of Xing spread further until, at last, they pressed into territories where disputes began. Shen had an unusual tactic. He declared the land a part of Xing, but the individual owners did not change. They would continue to build around them. Wherever people lived, he argued that it was their home. However, making claim to land that was not sown or not in use was not tolerated. Someone who would make use of it would take it from you. Bandits started to encroach upon the outskirts of town, but Xing was keen on defending itself. At first, there was no need for armies, but as it grew, it became obvious that dealing with threats such as monsters and bandits need not be privatized. Shen insisted that prisoners and lawbreakers be forced to work. However, not to be treated differently than anyone else, he insisted they be paid. One of the first jobs of prisoners was the unwanted and deadly military jobs, but should they succeed in such tasks? Depending on the severity of the crime, prisoners might be sent out on dangerous tasks over and over again until dead. Xing admired profit in all forms, and entertainment soon became one of the 12 houses of craft. If trades were considered profitable or important, they would become one of the 12 houses. The 12 were switched sometimes, depending on whatever house was viewed as important. It was not uncommon for there to be infighting and cutthroat competition. During the time of Shen, there was relative peace between the 12. He named himself the Final Word. In all disputes, Shen himself settled it, with a strong sense of justice. He often found strange or inventive solutions to problems, though not all worked out. Some houses were greatly displeased and felt held back by Shen. There were few regulations in Xing. It was possible to own slaves, and there was a value to every man and woman. Every beast could be bought and sold. Nothing was held sacred from the coin. So long as your house produced, you were considered valuable. Slaves were made of those who fell into debt, and what the owners could do with them officially was limited. If one became in debt to a family or house, they were required to work for the house until the debts were paid. There were clever men and women who made use of these slaves. Some kept their wages so low they could never escape their debt. Eventually, Shen made a decree. Every 12 years, all debts of slaves were forgiven, and all indentured servants would be freed from their debt without exception. They could continue working for their owners if they chose. The wiping of those debts angered most of the 12 houses, although they did make it for a better city to live in. He wanted workers, not slave laborers. Taxes were put off for as long as possible. For many years, the 12 houses believed in donations instead of taxes for certain causes. Ironclad agreements ensured that if someone donated for a particular purpose, it would be used for that purpose and nothing else. This often settled most issues on the creation of roads or minor military forces. However, it was unreliable and easy to cheat. Eventually, tariffs and small taxes were introduced, but the donation system was still used for some things. In Qing, anyone could donate to causes they championed, similar to offering money to a politician. But instead of a politician in this case, people donated to particular causes. When enough funds or goods were gathered, it was done. Simple as that. If there was a bandit problem in the north, one could donate for the purpose of removing those bandits. Guild halls often sprouted up in response to this system. While it was common to hire men for work, guild halls eventually took collections for specific changes to be made to Qing. Tax money generally went towards the defense of Qing. Qing began to rival its enemy nations. Long after the death of Shen, the city grew larger and more energetic. Going out in the streets, there would be scryers of what trades were in the most demand. What fields of study were needed this day? Papers and ink became pressed against blocks to form short pages. Advertisements could be seen using skilled art and presses. Books became common, although the need for scribes for magical books would always be in demand. Magic was used commonly in Qing for many daily needs, and it was one of the few places where one could cheaply hire a skilled magus to fix a problem with a home rather than beg a government like other nations. There was very little regulation on what type of work could be done or what was forbidden. A few rules existed to limit addictive substances and mental manipulation magic. Laws about offering children or wives as payment were struck down multiple times. Even with rules in place, not all followed them. As the number of laws grew, unscrupulous men and women found workarounds. Slavers did not become one of the 12 houses, simply because all 12 houses used them, and the yearly limit made it more difficult to sell slaves, especially near the end of the 12-year limit. Attempts were made to consider some humans as non-sentient and to consider some workers as beasts, allowing permanent ownership. Perhaps, because that would be bad for Qing or some moral standards existed, it was struck down every time. And the 12-year freeing of slaves was kept, because it was believed slavery would die out in time. Qing insisted it was not a nation of conquerors, but craftsmen. Things were changing, though. Greed was a sin Qing had in abundance. The city-nation saw great treasures throughout the world and often made attempts to claim them, be it mines or simply a dragon's hoard. Wars often began with large donations put in for a particular request. If enough people donated to a certain cause, even if that cause required taking something from a neighbor, it was always considered. If the donations grew large enough, it would eventually be done. Often the 12 had to consider the consequences of whatever causes people paid for, factoring them in as part of the cost. In the end, Qing eventually took part in battles or wars simply because the people wanted it. Peace forever not being possible, once a war did begin, they often went on for decades, long past their intended purpose, often requiring more and more donations. If the safety of Qing was put into question, tax money was required in addition. Wars broke out constantly between multiple nations, but Qing usually ended up the victor, often absorbing former enemies and forcing Shen's beliefs on them. Losers often ended up as indentured servants to the victors. So, there was some profit to be had in war. Qing's enemies quickly learned not to get in a war with Qing. Though relatively tame compared to some enemies after a war, Qing's armies were ferocious enough after their battle to cause their enemies to consider surrender to Qing as an option for those who were losing. In some cases, losing nations, not even fighting Qing, might request to join it for aid. Bargains could be struck, and if it seemed profitable for Qing, aid might be extended. Qing grew well past its intended size. The city of Qing was quickly becoming a country. Although officially they did not control their neighbors, Qing had considerable influence on people who chose to join them. This resulted in a small network of towns and cities, each serving their own interests, but Qing had an undeniable pull over their decisions due to their debt. It wasn't an empire in a strict sense, but the network did join in battles when it suited them, and especially if it was an easy victory. But as Qing grew, so too did the attention facing it. The first war against Qing was over resources. Disputes occurred over land and feeling threatened by Qing. It became a battle to simply hold on to what they had. Eventually, military forces had to be used to stop the constant trickle of attacking forces. Perhaps Qing did them an act of mercy with their victories, as it lessened the vast wasting of lives whenever opponents tried to break through Qing's borders. Still, proactively protecting by attacking was something Qing did constantly with relatively few invasions. As a nation, it tended to prefer bargains, so long as they were profits to be made. Qing's army was well provisioned and way ahead in terms of training, giving them a fierce reputation as adversaries not to be willingly fought. After one relatively long war came a second, one that lasted almost as long, spanning many years. It was known as the Ebon War. Later, it led to the Battle of Black Maw. The amount of energy inside the mountain of Black Maw became a discovery, a potential unknown power that near all nations tried to claim, even Qing. The only problem, anyone and everyone was trying to claim it, but when they got close, all would die before reaching the objective. So they resorted to protecting it and blockading others from reaching whatever treasure Black Maw hid. Many nations tried to prevent anyone else's success, yet the moment someone did reach it, the war ended just like that. Gauss put so many donations into the cause of this war, just to end it, after telling himself whatever he found would be worth it. The observatory was valuable, no doubt, but it needed to be kept secret, and it was in a place which was difficult to reach even in peace. For 3 generations, the Gauss family managed to keep their seat in the 12 houses. Ultimately, though, the wealth and influence faded so much, even conservative members of the 12 admitted the Gauss family would not recover from this. It took more than a down streak to remove a house that had been part of it as long as his. All the same, it was pointless to leave him on the council. He was a ruined man and was sick with dark dust. There was no doubt that he would not take the news well. The town as a whole was generous in terms of giving to the soldiers who lost their lives and to their treatment and care. As things stood, they had a great deal of expanding income for the care of the veterans. Expenses were carefully audited, and the 12 houses were quick to point out if something cost far too much. Abuse of donation funds was taken seriously, after all. It was doubtful that Gauss would be able to restore his fortune. As for the enemy nations, they were pouring so much into trying to get the prize in Black Maw, they neglected their home nations. Much like Qing, they needed to return home and lick their wounds. Some threats and monsters went unchecked for years, allowing for grave enemies to grow. Bandits became small nations. Monsters reproduced, and more recently, even witches were being talked about being a problem that, if left unchecked, could be a disaster. Gauss had read the reports. Witches had grown to numbers so large they were becoming a threat to cities, even one as sizable as Qing. Convincing anyone to deal with them was almost impossible. Still, Gauss had to keep silent about the looming threat to the world. Everything and everyone would die. He often sat in his room drinking while looking over maps and pondering what might be done. Ultimately, he was too sick and too tired to try anything. The servants who worked for his manor likely wouldn't work for him much longer, even if they were loyal. There was no telling what would happen to Alice. She would, no doubt, grow into a monster. She was already beyond him, but he was unwilling to ruin his family name by revealing her. A fact Alice took advantage of with his wife. His wife had gone mad, the servants were mad, and he could do little more than sit and wait for death. He hoped his work with the legal aids would be enough. Leonardo Gauss named Darius as overseer of his estate and executor who had custody of all resources. Perhaps he might know what best to do about Alice.